In the year 451 before the Common Era, the Roman Republic did something it had never done before. It suspended itself. Not through conquest or coup, but by deliberate choice. The consuls stepped down. The tribunes of the plebs laid aside their office. The machinery of republican government, with its competing magistracies and its carefully balanced antagonisms, simply stopped. In its place, Rome installed 10 men. 10 men to hold all power in the city. And to justify this remarkable concentration of authority, Rome offered an argument that would echo through centuries of political history. The emergency demands it. The task is too important for ordinary government. Trust us, it will be temporary. It was not temporary. To understand why Rome made this choice and what it cost her, it is necessary to go back further to the long, grinding conflict between the two orders of Roman society. On one side stood the Patricians, the old aristocratic families who monopolized the priesthoods, the magistracies, and the unwritten law itself. On the other stood the Plebeians, the freeborn citizens who fought in Rome's armies, paid her taxes, and buried their dead in her soil, but who had no reliable access to the legal protections that should, in theory, have been theirs. The problem was not merely inequality. The problem was opacity. Roman law, such as it was, existed in the memories and pronouncements of patrician priests and magistrates. It was not written down. A plebeian accused of a crime, or swindled in a contract, or crushed under debt, had no text to point to, no fixed rule to invoke. The law was whatever the man in power said it was, that morning in that courtroom. And the man in power was always a patrician. The plebeians had been pressing for codification for decades. They wanted the law carved in stone, or at least written on wood, so that every citizen could see it and appeal to it. The patricians resisted because the ambiguity served them. Power over interpretation is power over outcomes. To write the law down is to surrender a portion of that control. But by the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era, the pressure had become irresistible. A generation of political struggle, including the dramatic first secession of the plebs some decades earlier, had taught the patricians that defiance had its limits. And so a commission was proposed. 10 men, drawn from the patrician class, granted temporary supreme authority, tasked with producing a written legal code. They would work for 1 year. Then they would dissolve, and the republic would resume. The first board of 10 worked well. They produced 10 tablets of law. The sources tell us that their conduct was reasonable, even measured. Citizens brought disputes to their doors and found, to their apparent surprise, a degree of impartiality. The historian Livy, writing centuries later, portrays this first year with something approaching approval. The Decemviri, as they were known, behaved as the Republic's architects had hoped they would behave. And at the end of their year, they acknowledged that the work was not quite finished. 2 more tablets were needed to complete the code. And so they were renewed, for a second year, with the same powers, with the same 10 men. Or rather, almost the same. The composition shifted slightly, and one name rose to prominence above the others: Appius Claudius. Appius Claudius came from one of the oldest and most formidable of the patrician gentes, the great clans whose roots reached back to the earliest days of the city. The Claudii had a reputation, earned across generations, for a particularly cold and unyielding brand of aristocratic pride. Appius, in this second year of the Decemvirate, appears to have embodied that reputation completely. The second year was different from the first. As Livy records it, the Board of 10 began to display a hardening of manner, a dismissiveness towards citizens seeking redress, a tendency to surround themselves with armed attendants and to conduct their business with the gravity of permanence, rather than the modesty of caretakers. Each of the 10 men went about attended by 12 lictors carrying the fasces, the bundles of rods that symbolized magisterial authority, rods that in earlier days would also have carried an axe beyond the city walls, the mark of the power of life and death. 120 lictors moving through the streets of Rome was not the footprint of a temporary commission. It was the footprint of something that intended to stay. The two additional tablets were produced. The legal code, which posterity would call the 12 Tables, was complete. It was a genuine achievement. For all its limitations, and modern historians have noted that it was far from comprehensive, it gave Rome a foundation of written law that would endure for centuries. Cicero, writing 400 years later, would recall that Roman schoolboys were still made to memorize the 12 Tables in his own time. But when the code was complete, the Decemviri did not step aside. The constitutional crisis of 450 before the Common Era turned on a question that every republic must eventually answer. What happens when men granted emergency power decide that the emergency is never quite over? The answer in Rome's case began, as the sources tell it, not with a political abstraction, but with a girl. Her name was Verginia. She was the daughter of Lucius Verginius, a centurion serving with the Roman army in the field. By all accounts, she was young, betrothed, and of entirely unremarkable standing, a plebeian girl of no great wealth or political consequence. But Appius Claudius wanted her, and Appius Claudius, as head of the Decemvirate, was, for the moment, the most powerful man in Rome. What followed was a legal fiction, of a kind that only a regime secure in its own impunity would attempt. Appius arranged for one of his clients, a man named Marcus Claudius, to approach Verginia in the Forum and seize her, claiming she was not a freeborn citizen at all, but a slave, born of a slave woman in the household of Marcus Claudius, and therefore his property to dispose of as he wished. The claim was transparently false. Everyone present knew it was false, but it allowed the matter to come before a magistrate for adjudication. And the magistrate, of course, was Appius Claudius himself. Her father was sent for. He came from the army camp in haste, still in his military dress. He made his arguments. He called on witnesses. He appealed to decency and law and the most basic obligations of a magistrate toward truth. Appius ruled against him. Verginia was to be handed over to Marcus Claudius, pending a fuller hearing that everyone understood would never produce a different result. Verginius asked for a moment with his daughter, to say goodbye. The request was granted. He drew her aside, toward the market stalls at the edge of the Forum. He picked up a butcher's knife, and he killed her. He held her, and he killed her, and he said, as Livy records the words, that this was the only way he could give her freedom. What followed was an upheaval that Rome had seen before, though perhaps never quite this raw in its precipitating cause. The army in the field, when word reached the soldiers, refused to continue under commanders who served a government capable of this. The plebs of the city, for the second time in Roman history, walked out. They withdrew to the sacred mount, to Mons Sacer, the hill where memory held that the first great secession had taken place a generation earlier, and they waited. Without the plebs, Rome could not function. Without the army, Rome could not survive. The Decemviri, confronted with the reality that power rests ultimately on the consent, or at least the acquiescence of the governed, collapsed faster than their pride would have predicted. Appius Claudius, according to Livy, was arrested. He died in prison. Whether by his own hand or otherwise, the sources do not agree. His colleagues faded from the record into obscurity or disgrace. The Republic was restored. The consulship returned. The tribunes of the plebs resumed their office. And those who had served on the Decemvirate were barred from holding magistracies thereafter. But Rome did not simply return to the arrangements that had existed before the crisis. The plebeians had left and come back twice now, and each return had been accompanied by an expansion of their rights. The second secession produced in its aftermath what the sources call the Valerio-Horatian laws, named for the two consuls who oversaw their passage. These laws addressed the most persistent point of contention between the orders in a direct and consequential way. Decisions made by the plebeian assembly, the Concilium Plebis, voting in its own assembly on matters proposed by the tribunes, were henceforth to carry the force of law, binding on all Romans, patricians included. Not merely resolutions, not merely expressions of sentiment, law. This was not yet full equality. Modern historians are careful to note that the precise constitutional significance of these laws in the 5th century was contested even in antiquity, and that their full force took decades more to become unambiguous. The struggle of the orders was far from over. Patricians retained advantages in religion, in prestige, in access to the highest offices that would resist erosion for another century and a half. But the direction of travel had been established. The plebes had leverage. The assembly had a voice that could not simply be ignored. The episode of the Decemviri left a residue in Roman political memory that proved remarkably durable. Long after the specific grievances of 450 before the Common Era had been resolved or forgotten, the image of 10 men who would not relinquish their commission, of a ruler who turned law into a personal instrument, of a father who could find no other way to protect his child than to end her life, all of this remained a reference point in Roman civic thought. When, centuries later, ambitious men began to seek extraordinary commands and extended terms of office, when a general in the field declined to lay down his commission and cross a river back into civilian life, the Romans had a vocabulary for what they were watching. They had seen it before. They knew how these things began. The 12 tables themselves survived into the imperial period, though the original wooden tablets were almost certainly destroyed when the Gauls sacked Rome a generation after the Decemviri fell. The law they contained was reconstructed from memory and commentary, which is perhaps fitting. The Decemviri had produced Rome's first written law, and in doing so had also produced Rome's first systematic demonstration of what happens when guardians of the law decide that the law applies to everyone except themselves. The republic they failed to kill went on for another 4 centuries, but it was watching, and it was learning, and it was slowly, incompletely, generation by generation, building the argument that legitimate power has a beginning and a middle and an end, that a commission with a task completes the task and returns what it was given, that authority held in trust is not authority owned. Rome never quite managed to make that argument stick, but it never quite stopped making it either.